Good evening, everyone. It's time to bring this conference to a close. I know that we are running a bit late, but 6:30 was too early for dinner anyway, wasn't it? 7 is a much better time. And I'm personally very, very pleased that we had such rich, constructive, and respectful discussions at this conference. And it is something that cannot be taken for granted in the current environment, which is so full of toxicity and very polarized. But it's also something that is very, very much needed. So thank you all for that. And our discussions were not only constructive and respectful, but they were also intellectually engaging and enriching. They were thoughtful, and they were realistic, while at the same time, I really appreciated everybody's efforts to also include optimism in their perspectives. We all know that in our very fast-paced policy world, it's very difficult to find time to reflect. And that's also one of the objectives of this conference, to take a moment to reflect and to think, also very much needed. Yesterday, when we had the opening discussion, there was a characterization of the international policy environment as one of polarization, fragmentation, stagnation, and frustration. So if you imagine this as the 4 pillars of a house that you're building, that's not a house I want to live in. And if you then add on top of that the other analogy that we also heard on that panel, that one of the roof, remember? It's raining and you haven't repaired the roof. That's also what's happening now. But unfortunately, this is the house we all live in. It's a house with polarization, fragmentation, stagnation, and frustration. And it's raining quite heavily. So the international security situation, that's something that we've seen over the years at this conference, has not gotten better. Sadly, it's gotten worse. And if I can quote from this year's ZIPRI yearbook, the introductory chapter on international stability and human security starts with, global security continued to deteriorate in 2023 as it has for the past decade. So in my view, that should be a call for action and not a call for desperation. What we seem to be doing is heading in the wrong direction, which means that we all collectively need to do something differently. We had some mention in the last 2 days of the crisis of multilateralism and also the need for states to find common interests and to acknowledge that there are common interests. And to do this, we need to look broader, not just at nuclear issues that we just heard from Izumi, but also reflected in the discussions that we had here at this conference. Also looking at bio, at chem, at emerging technologies, at outer space, and conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. At the intergenerational panel that we had this afternoon, there was one question about the biggest threat that people perceive as a generation. And of course, that depends on who you ask. But I was not surprised that the younger members of the panel mentioned climate change as the top priority. And the, the less young panelists, they mentioned also the risk of nuclear war. They mentioned the polarization of society, and they mentioned disinformation. And Susanna in that panel also mentioned a very interesting nexus between climate change and arms control, which is that of the allocation of resources. There's a competition for allocation of resources with regard to attention, with regard to money, and with regard to expertise and human resources. So if we look carefully, I think we'll find plenty of common interests, but that also means that we need to maintain and safeguard spaces to have discussions about these common interests in a constructive and respectful way. And in that same panel this afternoon, there was also a question about optimism. How do I maintain some optimism in the current world? And for me personally, what gives me hope, and which is something where I find a lot of inspiration and being uplifted, are the next generation events that I've been participating in the last 2 years. With people from very different parts of the world, they tend to be very, very inclusive events. And some of them are the ones that are organized by the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, so the Next Generation workshop that we had yesterday with wonderful presentations, very, very high quality. The mentorship program with the wonderful mentees that we have in the room, already the fourth generation of that mentorship program, the non-proliferation awareness courses. And then I know that several of us are also organizing summer schools and winter schools. And I really feel quite strongly about the need to support and prioritize these activities, especially in the current tough funding environment. And that's something that Izumi also referred to. To move things forward, I think what we need are bright minds, we need innovative thinkers, we need engaged and persistent individuals, we need listeners, not just talkers. We often have a lot of talkers and not so many listeners. We need people who ask the difficult questions, we need people who turn their smartphone off, and we need people who connect across the differences that divide them and connect over their common humanity. And all of that I've seen at the Next Generation events that I've attended, and it's also something that I've seen at this conference, and that's something that gives me hope and makes me optimistic. And I would like to also add another positive note, and it's a reminder that the international humanitarian law principles that were agreed a century ago are still valid today and still a key reference point. So I'd like to not only thank those smart, creative individuals who came up with them, but also to remind ourselves that those principles didn't just sort of fall down from the sky, but there were individuals behind that who worked hard and who believed in them. And it's the same for the treaties that we discussed in the last 2 days and that we seek to uphold. They were painstakingly negotiated by skilled diplomats and experts in often a very difficult political environment. So that's something that I hope we will also see in the future and where many of you will be engaged in. Which brings me to the tulip analogy, which I used last year when I was concluding. So I was telling those who were there that I was in the Netherlands, I bought some tulip bulbs, and as instructed, I planted them before the winter in the expectation that they would flower and there would be beautiful tulips in the spring when the sun comes out. What happened is that this year was very rainy, so the slugs ate most of my tulips. So for me, what's really interesting is that I know the bulbs are still there, so I still have the expectation that the tulips will be out next year, but it also means that I need to protect them better next year. So I'll go back to the call I made last year, let's plant tulips. And some examples of the tulips that I have in mind are dialogue, education, next generation activities, and also diversity and inclusion. I know that we've come a long way with this in this arms control non-proliferation community, with the consortium, the network in this conference, but as one often says for other issues, there's much accomplished, but there's also much that still needs to be done. And I'd like to end with a quote by Daria, who was on the Next Generation panel this afternoon. She put it very beautifully, she said, if we work together, young and old, north, south, east, west, we can make progress as humanity. So that's, I think, a really beautiful note to end on. And that brings me to the thank yous. So the first thank you goes to the European Union and the EU member states for funding this conference, for funding the consortium and the network and all of the activities, and really believing in this forward-looking education dialogue activity. My thanks also go to the External Action Service and FBI for the excellent cooperation with you. Also thanks to all of you, the participants, the speakers, and the moderators. And of course, I would like to invite you to thank jointly with me our colleagues from Rome, from the International Affairs Institute, especially Ettore, Emanuel, and Natalie, for bringing us together here. I know it was really, really hard work, so thank you very much for that. So with that, this iteration of the conference is concluded. I look forward to seeing most of you, if not all of you, at the conference next year, the 14th annual conference of the EU on non-proliferation and disarmament. And now it's time for dinner, which is served outside. Thank you.